The Moaning of Laugh, or Socratic Dialogues for the Illiterate, a book by Frank Squire. The audiobook read by his son, Jasper Squire. Chapter 1. There were three of them, Professor Genius, Eggy, and Kingy, short for King Arthur. Nobody could remember where or when they first met. Professor Genius was given that title by a national newspaper after he had written an article proclaiming that Albert Einstein was nothing but a teller of fairy stories. Eggy was a part-time journalist who wrote occasional articles for magazines with limited appeal such as The Bricklayer's Arms and Construction Workers' Quarterly, for which he once wrote an article entitled Bricks and Their Uses. He also wrote for one of those magazines you would find in the back pocket of an airline seat in front of you. Valium for the print addicted was how he described his writing. However, on one occasion he wrote an article for the Marrow Growers Monthly, which suggested that the editor of a scurrilous tabloid was more interested in marrows than bosoms. Something along those lines. Anyway. The name of the newspaper cannot be mentioned because while it is keen to smear others, it is even quicker on the draw with its own lawyer-loaded libel six-shooter if you criticise it. Criticise it, and it will maul you to death with a frontal attack from its pages, causing you to feel like a lesser-spotted lurking toad. At the same time, its libel lawyers will cluster bomb you with letters, threats, invoices, summonses and writs requiring you to attend court under pain of contempt proceedings, imprisonment and demands for multitudinous costs. These tabloid lawyers will tell you that it is no good ignoring their letters or the court orders because if you do ignore them, something called a bailiff will attend your premises and remove either you or your property or both. Bailiffs are the infantry of the High Court, big stony-faced men in cheap grey suits and well-polished black shoes and brandishing not a machine pistol but a scrap of paper. Do not be misled either by the lack of size of this piece of paper or by its incomprehensible language. It is the instrument by which your home and property can be seized, by which you can be incarcerated, or by which you can be rendered insane. Following Eggy's jocular aside about said editor in the Marrow Growers Monthly, a muster of London solicitors swooped earthward to monetise Eggy's Marrow article for their own benefit and to a lesser extent for the benefit of the aforesaid editor. Eggy, not his real name, owned a house but lacked the encumbrances of wife or children. Somebody down the pub told Eggy that the only way to deal with the situation was to sell his house immediately, get his solicitors to pay the proceeds of sale to him by way of a bank draft made payable to bearer, change his name and move to Scotland. There he would be able to open a bank account under his new name and pay in the bank draft, no questions asked. He followed this advice, changing his name to Arthur Avago. He purchased for virtually nothing a small croft on the west coast of Scotland, just north of Glasgow, where he remained for 10 years, living in the one-roomed bothy that went with the croft, eating fish from the sea, homegrown turnips and potatoes. He regularly attended church, making modest but ostentatious contributions to the weekly collection. Scotland is by no means the worst place to live, and the west coast in winter is just as warm as the south coast of England. If you don't believe me, have a look at any decent atlas where you will find a map of Scotland showing the isotherms. These are lines connecting places sharing the same temperature. The winter isotherms for the UK run north to south, meaning that the winter temperatures in Cornwall and along the west coast of Scotland are more or less the same. Eggy would collect driftwood from the beach with which to heat his bothy. Water came from a spring nearby. He had a radio for BBC Radio 4. He also had a laptop. There was no internet available, not that that bothered him, but there was a bus service once a week if he was prepared to walk the 3 miles to the bus stop. He would then take his laptop to the extensive library in Glasgow and download books. When in Glasgow, recognising the need for human contact, he regularly attended an upmarket pub. Always correctly dressed and scrubbed, as well as conversing with the locals, he would also pick up prostitutes. The technique was simple. He would catch the eye of a woman he fancied. If she immediately looked away, then she was unavailable. On the other hand, if she held his gaze, she was available, and after a moment or two, she would wander over and he would offer to buy her a drink, and the evening's drama would begin. The net proceeds of sale from his former house he deposited in the bank, purchasing from time to time some of the bank's overpriced and underperforming financial products. There was method in this seeming madness. After 10 years crofting, he was in a position to re-establish himself back in England under his new name as a man of unimpeachable character, aided by fulsome testimonials from his banker and his vicar. Bankers, in spite of being the ultimate fraudsters, hiding behind their impenetrable wall of legal verbiage, are considered to be unimpeachable. Vicars, in spite of being liars on a cosmic scale, surely they can't believe all that biblical guff, are also considered to be reliable witnesses as to an individual's integrity. Eggy worried a lot about vicars and what they were purported to get up to. "I just don't believe it," he would mutter on hearing the latest clerical outrage. "It's propaganda delivered by the followers of the Antichrist." Someone once asked him who these followers of the Antichrist were. "They're everywhere, but you can't tell them apart because they look like everybody else, like Freemasons. Somebody told me they had vestigial tails, but you can't very well ask people you meet, e.g. your bank manager, to show you his bottom before handing over to him your money and the title deeds to your house." Kingy pondered this for a moment and then said, "Well, I suppose you could, but probably not in an open plan office." The professor once asked Eggy what was his worst moment as he fled into anonymity to escape from the hounding by the demon lawyers and their mercenaries, the club-footed bailiffs. He thought for a moment and then said, "Good question. The answer is, that moment was when my solicitor handed to me the banker's draft for the proceeds of sale of my house. It represented everything I had owned, my house sale proceeds, endowment policies, investments, everything. But it was payable to bearer so that I could pay it into any account in my new name. But if I had dropped it or handed it over, mistaking it for a £5 note, it would be lost forever, because the bank won't stop them like it will a cheque. It's like a gold ingot. If you allowed it to fall through a hole in your trouser pocket and you asked the bank for a replacement, it would be like going to the goldsmiths from whom you just purchased a gold ingot and saying, 'My good man, you will recall I was in here but a few minutes ago to purchase one of your fine ingots. Well, the bally thing just slipped through a hole in my trouser pocket as I was leaving here, and blow me for a game of soldiers, I have gone and lost it. Would you terribly mind slipping me a replacement?' Eggy now worked as a postman, and I remember the professor once asking him why so interesting a man as Eggy had such a mundane job. Eggy staunchly defended the postman job, saying it was the ideal job, combining the camaraderie of the sorting office with the gentle exercise of cycling through country roads to deliver the post. As the avuncular postman on the recruiting advertisements used to say, "Everybody is pleased to see the postman," to which slogan Eggy would add with a lascivious wink, "Even young single mothers stuck at home all day." The professor then started to tell an anecdote about a previous monarch. He said that the philosopher Bertrand Russell had been presented to King George VI. "Who is Bertrand Russell?" said Eggy. "God, don't you know anything? He was a famous mathematician and philosopher in the early part of the 20th century. A bit like Einstein, but without the whiskers." "Why the fuck should I know that? You are probably the most ignorant person I have ever met." "Well, I'm pleased to be good at something," said Eggy. "Anyway," continued the professor, "he also had numerous mistresses who sometimes got promoted to wife, and wives who sometimes got demoted back to mistresses. In addition to all that, he was an aristocrat, the 3rd Earl Russell." "Crikey," said Eggy. "I could just imagine the Sun headlines." "Don't bother. The Sun newspaper didn't exist until the second half of the 20th century. "What's all this got to do with Eggy being a postman?" asked Kingy. "It's just that Bertrand Russell was once presented to King George VI. The king, in the course of a brief monarchical moment of well-meaning small talk, said to Russell, 'It's a good thing everybody is not like you.' To which Russell replied without a moment's hesitation, 'It's a good thing everybody is not a postman.' This remark was followed by a silence, neither Eggy nor Kingy having realised that the punchline had been reached. "Why are we talking about postmen and some long-dead monarch?" asked Kingy. "It's called conversation. It's what humans like us do to demonstrate that we are friendly. If we were cats rather than humans, we might purr. If we were chickens, we might cluck in an amiable sort of chickeny way. Humans don't purr or cluck, they converse. The trouble with being human is that to converse, you have to have a subject matter to talk about. You can't just sit in a pub purring or clucking in a companionable way. There has to be a subject matter. That's why the English weather is so useful. It changes frequently, minute by minute, quite often, thus providing a useful subject for conversation. There would not be much point in talking about the weather if you lived in California, because it is always the same. Blue sky, warm breeze rolling in from the Pacific Ocean, golden sunshine." "You could say, 'Nice day again today,'" said Kingy. "You could," said the professor, getting irritated. "You could say it the next day as well, but it wouldn't be a very interesting thing to say, because the weather in California is always the same." Eggy was getting bored by this conversation about conversation. He said, "I was watching a television programme the other night which said that some apes conversed by displaying their bottoms. You should have seen his ape called a mandrill. It had a technicolour arse and the colours changed as you looked at it." Kingy said, "This mandrill thingy might not be able to see its own arse, so it might not know what it was talking about." The professor said nothing, but momentarily glanced on the direction of the young barmaid as she pulled a pint on the other side of the bar. Chapter 2. One evening, Eggy brought up the subject of President Putin. The professor said that he should keep his voice down, as Putin had spies everywhere, and he might end up with a lump of plutonium hiding in his underpants. "Bollocks," said Kingy. "The guy's a cunt and somebody ought to tell him. I've a good mind to send him a letter. I could email it to his embassy." "Don't mention my name," demanded the professor. "And keep your ruddy voice down. People are listening. There's bound to be spies in here. Look at those two over there with the teapot. Sure sign." "What would you write?" asked Kingy. "I would say, 'Dear President Putin, you are a cunt. Get out of Ukraine. The Ukrainians don't want you there. You are just a shitty bully with a face like a hamster that's pouched too many peanuts. You are not tough like Mr. Hitler. You are pathetic. Fuck off home. Yours truly, Kingy. That should do the trick, added Kingy. He'd be out of there like a shot. Have you ever thought of joining the Foreign Office? Asked the Professor. You are just the type they need. Good command of English, diplomatic, yet straightforward and to the point. No beating about the bush with you. Succinct is the word. Praise indeed, said Kingy, flushed with the unexpected compliment. I wouldn't use your own name, said Eggy. Why not, said Kingy. Because the men with the teapot full of plutonium would be round your place with their teapot and you would die a lingering death. I can imagine the headlines. Local idiot murdered by teapot. Ruskies on run, suggested the Professor dryly. It's possible I may not decide to write to Mr. Putin, said Eggy. Why does Mr. Putin use plutonium to kill people he does not like, inquired Kingy. It's because Mr. Putin is a bit squeamish, whereas Mr. Stalin liked to have his number one torture chamber immediately below his office in the Kremlin so he could hear the screams of his victims. Mr. Putin is squeamish. He wants his victims to suffer out of earshot. Death from ingesting plutonium is slow and painful. Also inevitable, said the Professor. Crikey, said Kingy, glancing furtively towards the place where the two men with the teapot had been sitting, but they had left, teapot and all. I shall never be able to look at a teapot the same way again. Daft things anyway, teapots, said Eggy. Completely unnecessary now we've got tea bags. My dad used to think tea bags were simply measures of tea, and he used to cut the tea bags open and then tip the contents into the teapot. He kept a pair of scissors by the teapot for that very purpose, said Kingy. Well, he was a farmer, wasn't he? This might be a good place to mention why Eggy was so called. Nobody now can remember what he was originally called, although his correct name must still be on his birth certificate, marriage certificate, criminal record, etc., assuming any of these events had taken place. He had always been Eggy, as far as anyone could remember. The common belief was that he was called Eggy because when a young man he repeatedly used the abbreviation EG, not necessarily in the right context, but often when he was lost for words or was unable to remember somebody's name, or instead of So Eggy came to be called Eggy, and his real name was known only to Somerset House and the denizens of the welfare state and possibly the Criminal Records Office. Well, you never know. The conversation moved on to another topic, the subject of conspiracy, which was popular with all three. There had recently been published yet another article about the assassination of President Kennedy, saying that Lee Harvey Oswald had not acted alone, but had been paid to assassinate the president by a wealthy woman who had been left in the lurch by the president, who was well known for his casual lechery. It's complete nonsense, said the Professor. The facts are clear. Lee Harvey Oswald, a local loony, decides to shoot JFK, shoots him, is quickly arrested, and is in turn murdered by Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner, while the police are moving Oswald between court and the police station. Ruby is found guilty after trial and is sentenced to death. He appeals, and while the appeal is working its way through the court system, Ruby is found to have cancer and dies a few months later. Ironic that, said Kingy, cancer sparing him from the electric chair. Yes, said Eggy, you would normally expect it to be the other way round. Normally, scoffed the Professor. Kingy, who seemed to be a bit of an authority on the assassination of presidents, said, most of what Prof says is true, except President Kennedy was not assassinated at all. The Professor and Eggy waited with bated breath for Kingy to continue. Go on. Kingy went on. Kennedy was a sick man. Amongst other things, he suffered from Parkinson's disease. Addison's disease, interrupted the professor. He was diseased, said Kingy, one way or another. Anyway, he was very tired as a result of all those diseases, so instead of JFK parading through Dallas in an open-top motorcade, he employed a look-alike. Hitler had them, and the Queen Mother. Easy for them too. The Hitler look-alike just had to dab his upper lip with a bit of charcoal, stick out his arm from time to time. The Queen Mother look-alike just had to put on a big hat and hold her head to one side. A dab of fish paste behind the ears and a strong gin, and the look-alike was ready to wave. She had to be taught how to wave. Royalty don't wave like normal humans. There is a range of waves. My favourite is the one where they twirl the hand like a pink lady butterfly having an orgasm. The Queen Mother was quite happy to be look-aliked by a man. There was a male corporal who had chubby calves just like the Queen Mother's. The corporal had a penchant for cucumber sandwiches, and oh God, he would stuff himself at them at garden parties behind Buckingham Palace. Got the Queen Mother a reputation for being greedy. Got himself sacked in the end for being too fat for the job. What's your evidence for all of this? Inquired the professor. You always want evidence. Take Adolf Hitler. After he swept into Austria in his fast-moving motorcade, with his arm stuck out like a railway signal, he got an ache in his shoulder. So he used more and more lookalikes. It was cheaper too. Security was hugely expensive when the Führer was on parade, but when there was a lookalike, Hitler said it would be a good thing if the lookalike was shot, because Hitler could claim to have made a miraculous recovery. So they kept security to a minimum when they used a lookalike. But Hitler would not use a female lookalike because had the female lookalike been shot, people might discover that the Führer did not have a... Kingy was lost for the word. That was one of Hitler's peccadillos, concluded Kingy. But where's the bloody evidence for all this gibberish? Demanded the professor, exasperated. You are always on about evidence, said Kingy angrily. You see that bloody thing up there, said Kingy, pointing at the sun. It's up there. You can see for yourself. You don't need bloody evidence. I can't see anything. Prove it. It could be a hallucination for all I know, said the professor. Chapter 3. One evening, when the three of them were once more ensconced in their favourite corner of the lounge bar, Kingy noticed that the professor was unshaven, contrary to his usual mode. In fact, he had not shaved for several days, but neither Eggy nor Kingy had dared to mention until now what they had both noticed, it being common knowledge that the professor did not care for comments on his personal appearance. You growing a beard? Kingy ventured nervously. No, snapped the professor angrily. I'm just not shaving, and growing a beard happens to be a byproduct of that activity. It's an inactivity, not shaving, rather than an activity, joined in Eggy. Yes, if you want to be pedantic. If you are not intending to grow a beard, may I ask why you have decided to refrain from shaving? Asked Kingy, doing his best to avoid pedantry. You may ask, and the reason is that I believe there has been a great conspiracy. But you said only the other day when we were talking about conspiracies that people who believed in them were all nutters, like people who believed in astronomy, said Eggy. Astrology, corrected the professor, not astronomy. Astrology is an ignorant superstition that the stars can foretell the future, whereas astronomy applies the most advanced mathematics to the study of the universe. It should not be easy to confuse the two. But when I pointed out that everyone had heard of the Guy Fawkes conspiracy to blow up the king while he was sitting on his throne in Parliament using a ton of gunpowder, you told me to shut up because that was different. That upset me, said Eggy. I'm sorry, said the professor, unusually apologetic. Of course there are real conspiracies like Guy Fawkes, But there are also nutters like Trevor Bike and members of the Reform Party who find conspiracies everywhere, when all that happened is that someone tries to do something useful, it goes wrong, and then somebody else tries to cover up the mistake. The national press go into Sherlock Holmes mode and dig away like terriers at a rabbit hole, shouting, "Conspiracy! U-turn! Resign!" etc., and blaming it all on the communists or the Freemasons. The professor paused, enabling Kingy to get a word in. "Well, what is this conspiracy you have uncovered, which is now preventing you from shaving?" "Well," began the professor, "until a few years ago, I used to buy a pack of razors for around £2. You know, those ones from the co-op with a little green handle and a stainless steel blade stuck in the end. Each razor would last about 10 days, so one packet would last roughly 100 days, so the daily cost of shaving, not including soap, was approximately 2p. A year or two ago, I found that those beloved little green disposable razors used to last fewer and fewer shaves. Finally, there came a time when those little green devils were no use at all. At more or less the same time, there was launched on the market a new type of blade, red in colour, elaborately packaged, and dramatically promoted on television, particularly promoting the fact that within their shaving head there were not one blade, as in the cheap green razors from the co-op, but 5 blades. It was true that they shaved well, and for some reason it was virtually impossible to cut yourself. So far, so good. An efficient, bloodless shave. Where's the harm in that? Said Eggy. Don't you see? These new red razors cost about 20 times as much as the old green ones. The manufacturers of razor blades have found a way of monetising shaving by blunting the green razors and heavily marketing the red ones, and heavily overcharging for them. Bloody capitalists! If that's not a conspiracy, I don't know what is, concluded the professor. What are you going to do about it? Asked Eggy. I'm going to write to the Times. That's what you always do. Then you get a huge, long letter from one of those vicious firms stuffed with smug, vulpine lawyers threatening to sue you for libel and demanding a written apology to be published in the Times and millions of pounds by way of damages. You spend a few sleepless nights and then offer to send a letter of apology and donate all your savings, 112 quid, to their favourite charity. It's not cheap. Free speech. Eggy continued. So why is it called free speech if you are not allowed to say what you like without being threatened with bankruptcy and suicide? You can't be threatened with suicide, pointed out the professor. Suicide is by definition something you do to yourself. Now it's you who are being pedantic, said Eggy, feeling he had scored a point. The conversation wandered to a close and they finished their pints and drifted off to their separate homes. Chapter 4. One evening, Eggy and Kingy were sitting in their usual corner, quite at ease in a companionable silence. They saw the professor enter and slowly make his way to the bar to purchase his pint. Looking over towards their corner to direct a nod in their direction, the professor inadvertently bumped into another customer wearing a long black leather coat. A new customer certainly not seen by Eggy or Kingy before. However, even Eggy and Kingy knew that the expensive black leather coat was the uniform of the local senior drug dealer, and the 2 young men with him were his enforcers. Their presence meant that one of Leathercoat's street dealer's accounts did not balance. Imagine a double-entry system with 2 buckets, one marked cocaine and the other marked cash. If the bucket marked cocaine was full and the cash bucket were empty, then the street dealer had yet to start marketing. He would get a minor kicking, reminding him to get on with the business. If one bucket was full of cocaine and the other bucket was full of cash, then the street dealer was probably working for some other main dealer with other buckets. Major kicking. If the cocaine bucket was empty and the cash bucket was full, then the street dealer was late in handing over the cash. Major tongue lashing, followed by minor kicking. If both buckets were empty, then the street dealer had worked hard but had stolen the cash. The buckets had failed to balance. Hospital kicking. "Watch out, mate," said Leathercoat, angry at being bumped into. "I am sorry," said the Professor, apologetically. "I was distracted." "Distracted?" said Leathercoat, dabbing at the front of his coat. "I should think you were. I think you should buy me a new coat." "Well, I have said I am sorry. I don't think I've caused any damage," said the Professor, peering at the soft, shiny leather with just the slightest hint of mockery. "Do you know who I am?" "No," said the Professor, slightly amused by the question. "Do you know who I am?" repeated Leathercoat more loudly. "I don't know who you are, but someone here may." With that, the Professor stepped back and, raising to address everybody in the lounge bar, said loudly, "Listen, everybody. There is a man here who seems to have forgotten who he is. Can anybody help?" Eggy and Kingy thought it was funny, and there were a few muffled titters, but most of those in the bar instinctively knew that Leathercoat was not the sort of man to mess with or to laugh at. "Look, I am sorry, but I could not resist it. I'll buy you a pint," said the Professor to Leathercoat. "You clever buggers are all the same," said Leathercoat. "You can't hold your tongues. It's all got to come out like diarrhea. You can buy a round for me and my mates over there." He pointed at a table. 3 pints of best, that is, and a bottle of brandy to wash it all down." "OK," said the Professor. 3 pints it is," giving a nod to the barman, who rapidly pulled 3 pints and then carried 2 glasses of his best bitter over and placed them in front of Leathercoat's 2 companions. The Professor picked up the 3rd glass and walked over to Leathercoat with it. "Where do you want it?" asked the Professor. "Where do you think?" replied Leathercoat, his back to the Professor. "Down my bloody neck." "Are you being sarcastic?" said the Professor. "There you go again. Swallowed a fucking dictionary, have we? No, I'm not being Socratic or whatever the fuck." "Just making sure," said the Professor, and then he tipped the whole pint of best bitter over the head of Leathercoat. The bar fell silent, and the Professor beat a rapid but dignified retreat. By the time Leathercoat and his 2 enforcers had got to the door, the Professor, Eggy and Kingy were well on their way home. The following week, the Professor and his 2 companions were once more sitting in their usual places in the lounge bar, when 2 men in expensive dark suits came and stood at the bar having a quiet drink. Kingy said to the Professor, "I don't like the look of those 2. I think we should leave. I don't think we should have come after last week." "Everything will be fine. You wait and see," said the Professor. And just as he had said it, in walked Leathercoat, this time unaccompanied by his enforcers, presumably absent because they were on their way to administer a good kicking to one of their street dealers. Leathercoat walked up to the bar near to where the 2 suits were chatting and turned towards the Professor and, raising his voice, shouted, "Not a good idea for you to come back here after what happened last time, you dictionary fucking math. You owe me. We'll start with a pint. I want it now." "Coming," said the Professor, and made his way to the bar, where he ordered 2 pints, passing one to Leathercoat, who drank it down in one long gulp, gave a noisy belch, and then, raising the empty glass, he attempted to smash the pint pot over the Professor's head. The attempt was, however, thwarted by one of the two men in the dark suits who grabbed the raised arm of Leathercoat, while the other suit grabbed Leathercoat's free arm, and together they dragged Leathercoat toward the entrance, where they flung him out into the street. Just like a scene from an ancient cowboy film, where the town drunk is flung out of the saloon when he has become obstreperous. It was all over in seconds. One of the dark suits gave the professor a wink, and then they were gone. "Crikey," said Kingy, unused to such drama. "I think we should leave." "It's all right," said the professor. "Leathercoat won't be back after he has been humiliated." "Well, who were those guys in the suits?" asked Kingy. "They do security. I thought there might be trouble this evening, so I gave them 50 quid each to hang around." "Crikey," said Kingy. "You are sort of Professor Al Capone. Haven't you committed a criminal offence?" "Don't think so," said Eggy, who prided himself on his knowledge of the law. "He's come to a bar where he occasionally comes for a drink. He's threatened with assault. 2 men intervene to prevent him from being harmed. You are entitled to defend yourself from assault, and you are entitled to protect others from being assaulted." But the professor did not speak to the dark suits. "Nothing in the law that says you have to speak to people you meet in bars," said Eggy authoritatively. "So, who is Leathercoat, and why is everyone so frightened of him?" asked Kingy, mystified by recent events. "It's capitalism," pronounced the professor. "What happens is that a Colombian peasant in South America wanders off into the snake-infested jungle where he spends all day picking a basket full of leaves from the coca plant. When he gets home, provided he has not been arrested by the jungle police or bitten by pit vipers, he sells the leaves for a few Colombian pesos to his buyer, who sells the leaves for a huge profit to somebody who sells the leaves for a huge profit to a processor, who turns the coca leaves into a white powder, cocaine, and sells the white powder for a huge profit to an exporter, who at a huge risk sends the cocaine across the Atlantic and sells it at a huge profit to the importer, huge profit, who sells it to Leathercoat, huge profit, who sells it to his street dealers, who sell it to you and me so that we can have a couple of hours of euphoria." "Swallowed a dictionary again? You'll have leather pants after you," said Kingy. "I've missed out one thing," said the professor. "By the time the cocaine has got to old leather pants, the price after all those profit add-ons is so high that he has to mix the cocaine with some cheap powder. Chalk is favourite, also baking powder. Anything powdery that looks like cocaine. I don't suppose Leathercoat checks with the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency before cutting his cocaine." "So what happens if somebody in that chain fails to pay for his cocaine?" asked Eggy. "Well," said the professor, "the unpaid can't just toddle off to the High Court and say to the big red judge in his big curly wig, 'What ho, Mr. Honourable Bewigged Being? That bastard Leathercoat has not paid me the 2 million squid he owes me for that last bag of coke I sold him. Please, O mighty one, cut off his ears and stuff them up his bottom, and extract from him the 2 million quid he owes. And moreover, please forgive my language, but I am but an ignorant peasant, unfamiliar with the posh lingo of this court. Moreover," you can't say it yourself. "You have to have one of those barristers' public school posh boys with the right voice, right words, right accent, and robed in a gown." The professor stopped. "I've missed out the most extraordinary bit. The barrister, when addressing the court, has to wear his gown, but he also has to wear a particular type of headgear. If he is not wearing the headgear, the judge may send him a note saying words to the effect, 'While you are improperly addressed, I am unable to hear you.' So the barrister has to shuffle off, bowing and scraping and apologising to fetch the right headgear. Now," continued the professor, You may think that this piece of headgear might resemble a mitre, or a biretta, or some sort of helmet. But no. The piece of headgear required is nothing less than an 18th century gentleman's wig. A wig! With curls! Even the women? Yes, even the women! Quite extraordinary. Anyway, where was I? Yes, you can't see anything at all about getting the money owed to you because the High Court will not help you with a drug contract, be wigged or be unwigged. Why not? Because it is a criminal offence even to have the stuff in your possession. So it is no use asking the court for help when the bleeders don't pay. You send in the enforcers, telling them what level of violence you want. Kicking, good kicking, hospital kicking, kneecapping. It's best to pay up front when dealing with enforcers. They do expect people to keep their side of the bargain and they do enjoy their work. So, it's a sort of ladder, with the cocaine increasing in price every time it's passed onto somebody new. A bit like pass the parcel, said Eggy, who was beginning to get the idea. So who starts the money up the ladder? Anybody who uses the stuff. One or two of the people in this pub probably, ordinary people, electricians, bricklayers, actors, cooks, celebrities, celebrity plumbers, celebrity chefs, users. The users create all this mayhem. And how does leather coat fit in? Probably dyslexic at school, hated doing badly and being humiliated, misbehaved, got expelled, can't get a job, no way of earning money, yet he still wants the same things as you and me. Nice car, nice house, holidays abroad, leggy blonde. Becomes a street dealer, acquires enforcers, acquires his own street dealers, enlarges his territory, buys a leather coat to show he is the boss. Soon he is able to operate a huge financial empire from the top of the ladder, more like a pyramid than a ladder. He never touches cocaine itself and never carries large sums of money. He relies entirely on bribery and thuggery to work his business, concluded the professor. So what's to be done? Said Eggy. That's easy. The users fuel the system, so lock 'em up. Need not be for long. 3 months for a celebrity chef in one of those terrible cells of our Victorian prisons with added cockroaches and rat shit nibbles would deter anybody. Stop the users and the pyramid would tumble. What about leather jacket? Doctors like the challenge of a really ill patient. Teachers, on the other hand, like to teach the really intelligent students who scarcely need teaching at all. Change the narrative and instead of prioritising the sixth form teachers, prioritise the thicko teachers. Give them more money, more prestige, the best classrooms. Stop humiliating, punishing, expelling the leather jackets and start to teach them. Make the thickos proud. Proud of their stupidity. So your policy would be to hate the drug users and love the thickos, said Eggy. Could not have put it better myself, said the professor. Chapter 5. There they were, all three sat in the usual corner, pint pots in front of them, Kingy's pot virtually untouched, the other two nearly empty. Why don't you order a half? Professor asked Kingy. It seems a waste buying you a pint when you only take a sip, leaving the rest behind when you stagger home. It's not a waste. I like the look of the pint pot. It's not for looking, it's for supping, retorted the professor. Leave him alone. You are always on about his pint pots, said Eggy. At least he does not tip it over people's heads. One thing I've always wanted to know about you, Kingy, said the professor, changing the subject, is why on earth you are called Kingy. The professor had a point. Kingy was most unkinglike. short, bald, apart from a single tuft of hair which emerged from the top of his head, and which Kingy dispersed all over his head, so that from above Kingy looked like a pie chart which had been left out in the rain. From all other vantage points, he looked as bald as an egg. He generally wore a battered grey herringbone suit purchased from Marks and Spencer's years ago, possibly decades ago. He worked in a local bank, not behind the counter dishing out the cash, but tucked away in some hidden corner where he checked those nasty letters that banks sometimes send to their customers. He had to check that the dates, sums and other variables mentioned in the letter were correct, and that the nasty letter complied with the bank's nasty letter policy. It's all being computerised now, so all Kingy had to do was to sign the manager's name. Kingy had never met the manager. The nearest he had got to the manager was when he once walked past a door which had the word manager painted on it. He had never seen the door open, neither had he seen anyone use the door. Sometimes he wondered if there even was a manager. "I've always been called Kingy," replied Kingy, in answer to the question. "There must be more to it than that," said the Professor. "After all, and don't get me wrong, but you're not exactly monarchical material. No offence meant." "None taken," replied Kingy, sharply, deeply offended by being once again reminded of his physical and sartorial inadequacies. He went on. "I was christened Arthur, and virtually as soon as I could read, various uncles and aunts gave me books about King Arthur and his knights." "A literary family," chipped in the Professor. Ignoring him, Kingy went on. "I became obsessed. I read them all again and again. I loved reading about the knights going on their quests, killing dragons, rescuing maidens, and seeking out robber knights and challenging them to duels in which the knights charged at each other on horseback with their lances. The good knights always managed to knock the bad knights off their horses. Then the good knight, sword in hand, would stand over the bad knight lying prostrate on the ground and make the bad knight promise, on pain of death, to go to Camelot and kneel before King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, pay homage and swear allegiance." Eggy interrupted. "I used to read that stuff. Sir Lancelot was my favourite. He was King Arthur's favourite as well." "Sir Lancelot," uttered Kingy almost ecstatically. "He was the best knight of all. Living sumptuously in his castle joyous guard, when he was not out questing or battling the pagan Anglo-Saxons with his mighty sword, alongside his beloved King Arthur." "I remember Castle Joyous Guard," said Eggy. "Before Sir Lancelot took it, it was called Castle Dolorous Guard. A wicked knight lived in it, and his dungeons were full of prisoners who had not paid their rent. Good Sir Lancelot fought the tyrant, and as the tyrant lay on the ground, blood oozing from the joints in his armour, Sir Lancelot cut his throat, set the prisoners free, and sanctified the castle by removing the hideous curse that hung over the castle like a toxic raven. The castle is still there on the coast of Northumberland, high on a cliff, overlooking the dunes and the sea, but it's now called Vanbrugh Castle, owned by the Armstrong family, who run a shipbuilding business on the River Tyne. They build frigates and destroyers for the Royal Navy," added the Professor, feeling left out. "But there is a mystery," said Kingy, ignoring the interruption. "Several mysteries, in fact." "Go on," said Eggy. "First, there is the sword in the stone, mysteriously placed there by Merlin, the arch-wizard, a medieval Einstein who announced that whoever pulled the sword from the stone was the true King of England. Everybody had a go, but nobody was able to heave it an inch, and then along comes the boy Arthur, has a go just for fun, and behold, he pulls the sword and out it slides like shit through a goose, if you will pardon the expression, like a knife through butter. I know, said Eggy, now getting as carried away as Kingy. He takes the sword off to court to show it to his mates and his guardian, the gentle Sir Kay. And as soon as the knights see the boy Arthur with the sword, they all fall about like they had fainted. Then whiskery old Merlin glides up and raises Arthur's right arm like Arthur had just become heavyweight champion of the world, and shouts, "Behold King Arthur, the true King of England." Then the knights all hobble up, armour clanking and squeaking, and kiss Arthur's hand. Arthur is a bit shocked by this behaviour, not having been to public school. Then the women, in their colourful robes and pale, beautiful faces, shuffle up and do their knees bendy bit and give Arthur an even more mournful look before moving on. Then old Merlin takes Arthur off to his cave and tells him the facts of life. What were the facts of life? Queried the professor, sounding bored. The facts of life were that Arthur was the son of Uther Pendragon, King of Britain, making Arthur the rightful heir. Who was his mum? His mum was Igraine, wife of the King of Cornwall. The professor suddenly woke up. Of course! I remember now. It's all in this film Excalibur. Uther Pendragon took a fancy to Igraine, who lived in a rocky castle built into the cliffs at Tintagel. He forced his way into the castle while her husband was away at war and bonked her over the back of a chair. It must have been a noisy business. Why noisy? Asked Kingy, somewhat horrified at this lurid account of his fallen idol's conception. Well, said the professor, warming to the subject. Uther Pendragon, according to the film, was wearing full armour which squeaked and rattled, a bit like the percussion section of a brass band. Unless, of course, he had the good sense to apply plenty of lubricant beforehand. You can't rely on risque modern feature film to tell you how King Arthur was conceived 1,500 years ago. That's hardly historical evidence, said Kingy, aggrieved to hear that his hero was the product of a coarse and clanking bonk. They never mention that in my King Arthur books. I don't believe it. What about the Holy Grail? Said Eggy. Ah, the Holy Grail. I remember the Holy Grail. It would turn up at night in some lonely ruined church or monastery, shimmering dimly as if shrouded in fog, roaming amidst shattered cloisters, never allowing the questing knight to come near enough to touch it, said Kingy. Sounds a bit like my first wife, chortled the professor. Kingy continued. But there was some dark secret hanging over Sir Lancelot that meant he would never be allowed to see the Holy Grail. The professor interrupted again. It was no secret. Sir Lancelot had bonked Queen Guinevere. It did not say that in my children's book. The author just left it out altogether. I only discovered it later when I went to a museum and saw a painting. It was of an apple orchard at night. The apple trees were hung with big red apples. Testicles, shouted the professor. Kingy, ignoring the interruption, went on. There was a bright moon, and on the ground, in a pool of moonlight, lay Queen Guinevere, her robes in disarray spread all about her, her crown still on her head. Her black stole hung over the branch of an apple tree, a mournful expression on her pale face. Nearby stood Sir Lancelot, grim-faced, thrusting his sword into its scabbard, and looking over the wall, half in shadow, was King Arthur, his hand on the hilt of his sword, ready to draw. After that, King Arthur and Sir Lancelot went to war, and the pagan Anglo-Saxons, whom King Arthur had once driven from England, sided with Sir Lancelot. Mordred, son of King Arthur, and his sister Morgana, yes, his sister, they were all at it, like in EastEnders. His sister Morgana also sided with the Anglo-Saxons. Mordred was fatally wounded at the Battle of Camlan, but not before Mordred had fatally wounded King Arthur by cleaving his helmet with a blow from his axe. King Arthur's faithful knight Sir Bedivere carried the dying Arthur from the battlefield. So began the Dark Ages, concluded Kingy. So it was the temptations of the flesh that gave rise to the Dark Ages, laughed the Professor. Anyway, I've got to go. Perhaps we could hear more about King Arthur next time. After all, he is the once and future king. So he could be back any time, soon to usher in a new golden age. We could certainly do with one of those, said Eggy. Chapter 6. You going to tell us about Excalibur, King Arthur's sword, said Eggy. Yes, said Kingy, I have not forgotten. All three had only just arrived at the moon, their pint pots of bitter in front of them. The Professor's already half empty, Eggy's down an inch, and Kingy's still untouched. Drink up, Kingy. Let's get you started, commanded the Professor. But I don't want to hear a word about that bloody sword. The only bit I remember is the bit where Sir Bedivere chucks the bloody thing in the lake, and an arm rises up out of the water, grabs it, and submerges back into the water, clutching the sword. Our English teacher, Mr. Braybrook, old perv, was always reading to us the poem by Alfred Tennyson, Mort D'Arthur. And when he got to the words describing the arm, he would start to blub like he was at a funeral. Crikey, said Kingy. But what were the words? The Professor put on his Hamlet face like he was looking towards a far horizon, uttered a dramatic silence, and spoke the blubber-inducing words, clad in white samite, mystic wonderful. Those words made your English teacher blub. No wonder he was one of... Eggy was lost for words with which to express his incredulity. But what is samite? Don't know, said the Professor. Google it when you get home. Not in here. Googling is forbidden. He pointed to the sign over the bar which read, No Googling in here. I know, said Kingy. Samite is a silk fabric interwoven with silver and gold thread. It has mystical qualities. Crikey, said Eggy. What a bleeding know-it-all. I am fed up with King Arthur, white samite and mysticism, none of which, as far as I am concerned, exists or has ever existed. Here the Professor was momentarily interrupted by an expostulation from Kingy, which was ignored, like a mild belch accidentally escaping during dinner. I want to tell you about the man who tried to scam me, said the Professor, determined as usual to be heard. Go on, said Eggy encouragingly. The Professor, who seldom needed encouragement, went on. The other day the phone rang. I answered. I knew it was a scammer by the time on the clock. It was just after the time scammers come on duty in Myanmar, or Burma, it used to be called in the good old days of the Empire. Now look what's happened to the place. Like a nest of warring vipers and warehouses full of scammers sitting in rows, their keyboards on little tables in front of them like a school classroom. The scammer said, Good morning, Mr. Firestone. How are you today? That's another clue. They often ask you how you are, these scammers. I told him I was well, but the name was Firestone, to rhyme with C. So he then apologised and started addressing me as Mr. Firestone E. He started to tell me he was ringing on behalf of the government body that regulated the insurance industry. I said to him, Look, before you go any further, can I ask you a question? Yes, by all means, Mr. Firestone, ask away. So, I say, "Are you a scammer?" I hear a sharp intake of breath all the way from Myanmar. And then the scammer said angrily, "You are very rude. You know nothing about me." "On the contrary," I said, "I know that you did not do well at school. You did not, did you? You lack education." Everybody in Myanmar lacks education because of the disruption caused by the civil war. "What else do you know?" "There has been a recent death in your family." Every family has a death in Myanmar that happened more frequently because of the civil unrest. "Yes, I admit there has been a recent death, my cousin Bangri." So a young death if Bangri was a cousin. The professor continues, "A young man's death, a tragic death, very sad, very unfortunate. His parents are bereft. As for you, your parents are not pleased with you, are they? You may make lots of money, but they wanted you to become a doctor or some other professional person." The scammer says, "This is true. I failed my exams." The professor continues, "You certainly failed your exams, but if you don't go to the lessons, you can hardly expect to pass the exam. Besides, you did not even bother to turn up for some of the exams." The scammer says, "You are so right. It's amazing." "You know your scamming hurts your victims," continued the professor. "Many of them elderly British with only modest savings for their old age. Pensioners very often. But you justify it by saying to yourself that the British plundered your country in the days of empire. So now it is the turn of the imperialists to be the victims." The scammer replied, "This is true as well. I do often think that." The professor continued, "What about your siblings?" This was a shot in the dark. Scammer, "Siblings? What are siblings?" The professor continued, "Brothers and sisters. Yours are not pleased with you. They think you are a crook. In fact, they are rather ashamed of you, particularly your sisters." Scammer says, "Sister, not sisters. One is quite enough. She says that my being a crook spoils her marriage prospects because nobody wants to marry into a family with a crook in it. A con man like me." The professor replied, "No, you are not very marriageable, with no profession, no skills apart from scamming." The scammer replied, "But how do you know all this? We have never met before or even spoken to each other. Yet here we are and you seem to know all about me." The professor says, "I have this app on my computer, which has told me about you. It listens to the sound of your voice. It analyzes every ripple, each rise and fall, each tremble. It analyzes the words you chose and your tone. From all that, it tells me everything about you, your age, your health, your knowledge, your traumas. If I was a doctor or a bank manager, I would certainly get one of these apps. Very useful to a bank manager, because the app would tell him if a potential borrower was likely to default on a loan. Good for a scammer, because you would be able to tell in seconds whether your target would be scammable. You should get one. It would save you the trouble of trying to scam people like me, who see through your trickery the moment they hear you speak on the telephone." The scammer replied, "But how would I do that?" "The app would listen to my voice for a few seconds, and from that it would be able to tell you about me, everything. You should get one. You don't want to be wasting your time talking to people like me. Anyway, I am off now. I wish you bad luck with your scamming. You are not very good at that either. A bit of a failure all round." The scammer replied, "Oh, hang on. I earn quite a lot of money, but I would always like to earn more, so that I can retrain as a pharmacist, or perhaps an optician, even a doctor. I would like to have one of these apps. How do I get hold of one?" The professor replied, "It's not easy, and the app is expensive." The scammer said, "Go on, I want one." "I could get you one, as it would be for a good course, if it enabled you to train to be something useful." The scammer says, How much do they cost? Professor replied. The app costs £400, which together with VAT at 20% comes to £480. If you send that to me today by bank transfer, I can stream the app to you. The scammer replied, Oh, give me your bank details, account name, number and sort code, and I will send you the money immediately, provided you promise to download the app immediately, please. You must send me an invoice, then I can claim on expenses. So the professor promised. He then emailed an invoice showing the fee of £400 and the VAT of £80 and forwarded his bank details, and lo and behold, within a matter of minutes, as he watched his account online, so handy online banking, the cash flocked in, all £480 of it. The thought of the VAT made him laugh to himself. Some minutes later, the scammer rang, again demanding to know if the professor had forwarded the app to him, to which he replied, Fuck off, scamming cunt. The professor, feeling rather pleased with himself, had then closed down his computer and wandered off to the Moon pub. Was that the end of the matter? Asked Eggy. No, it was not, said the professor angrily. Come on, don't keep us in suspense, said Kingy. Well, the next morning I booted up the computer just so that I could look at the £480 I had scammed off the scammer. Up came my online bank account, and to my horror, the 3,000 or so credit balance I normally keep in it as a float had gone. Just the £480 from the sale of the non-existent app. It dawned on me that I had been scammed. I had given my bank details to a bloody Burmese scammer, and the blighter had cleaned me out, apart from what he owed for the app. That will teach you to mess with a scammer, said Eggy. Teach me what? Snarled the professor, but not waiting for an answer he went on. There's more. Go on, said Kingy, all agog. Later that day, I received a telephone call from HMRC. At least that's where he said he was from. He sounded plausible enough. He told me that HMRC had been looking at unusual bank transactions, for example, where people not registered for VAT purposes had charged VAT on a transaction. Where this happened, it amounted to the criminal offence of fraud, for which the maximum sentence was donkey's years in the slammer and possible sequestration of other assets, such as landed property. He went on, made me feel like I was Jack the Ripper, caught red-handed with his trousers down, so to speak. It had come to the attention of the authorities that I was not VAT registered. But in spite of that, I had issued an invoice for £400 showing £80 VAT had been charged to my customer. If this was the case, and it looked like very much it was the case, then I was guilty of fraud. In normal circumstances, this would lead to my arrest, interview under caution, charging, trial before judge and jury in about 10 years' time, followed by a lengthy custodial sentence. I tried to explain that it was a bit of a joke and I was trying to scam the scammer. It's no joke, he said. Why you should think committing an act of fraud on your innocent customer and on HMRC is a joke, I don't know. HMRC does not joke. However, HMRC can be magnanimous. There is some mitigation. First offence, as far as we know, modest sum involved. It could be dealt with by way of a statutory penalty. But next time you will be up before the judge with his wig and his red robe. The other day in court, some old geezer fainted. When the judge slid into court in his red robe, the ambulance was called and the old geezer soon came round and his case was adjourned for 18 months. Anyway, enough of this friendly chat. Are you willing to accept a statutory penalty for third-degree fraud? Yes, said the professor. How much? I have virtually nothing in my account at the moment. The VAT man said, I see you have an overdraft facility of £2,000. We will take that. I will give you the bank account details. We will also have to take the $480 your customer paid you for the app because it was being obtained by you dishonestly. You can't be allowed to retain the proceeds of crime. We will notify your customer victim by email that he has been the victim of crime and he may recover the unauthorised VAT payment from HMRC. The professor lapsed into silence. Is that it? Asked Kingy. What about the VAT man? Was he kosher? There was a long pause before the professor answered. The next day I began to have doubts about the VAT man, so I rang the local VAT office. A robot answered, telling me that the office was very busy and I might have to wait a long time to speak to anybody and it might be quicker to go online. I told the robot that I was not a piece of washing to be hung out on a fucking washing line and I wanted to talk to a fucking human. I then had to listen to a long lecture telling me not to be abusive or aggressive and that I must treat civil servants with respect. The robot then told me I was in a queue and may have to wait some time. I waited a bleeding hour or more listening to soothing music, Elgar I think, and I got angrier and angrier with every simpering note. By the end, said the professor, I gave up waiting. To cut a long story short, I rang a London firm of accountants saying I wanted telephone advice from one of their senior men. I was told the fee would be £500 together with VAT of £100 payable in advance. I paid by credit card and spoke to one of the accountants that afternoon. At the end of my sorry story, I could hear the man laughing uncontrollably at the other end. What's so funny? I asked. Forgive me, he said, but in answer to your questions, yes, you have been scammed by the so-called VAT man. How do you know? I know because HMRC do not operate in the way you have described. He detailed why he was certain that the so-called VAT man was a fraudster and concluded by telling me that the circumstances indicated that I was not cut out to be a scammer. I told him he could go fuck himself and slammed the phone down, not necessarily in that order. Kingy got out his phone and started adding up the professor's losses. You can put that bloody thing away, roared the professor, slamming his empty pint down on the table and striding off angrily into the night. Chapter 7. Eggy and Kingy were sitting in their usual corner, their pint pots nearly half empty. The professor was conspicuously absent. Wonder what's happened to him. Not like him to be late, said Eggy. Perhaps he is depressed as a result of being scammed. His attempt at scamming the scammer failed miserably. What an idiot. Must have cost him over £6,000. But as he was speaking, the professor appeared at the bar and then wandered over. In his hand, not a pint pot, but a half pint glass. Don't mention the scam, muttered Eggy. He won't want to be reminded about that. The professor sat down, carefully placing the glass on the table. Bloody bank manager, he snarled as he sat down. What's yours done now? Kingy politely inquired. Well, you know I got scammed, bloody fool that I am. Well, I also got overdrawn as a result. What's more, unauthorised overdrawn. And all my own fault, says the bloody bank manager, rubbing it in. And you're not a victim of crime that the bank has to compensate you for. In fact, you're the victim of your own crime that went wrong. He says I am like a safe breaker whose gelignite blew off his own foot. He seems to find that very funny and keeps asking me how my foot is, and then bursting into howls of laughter and shouting amidst his mirth, blew off his own foot. Why don't you complain? Said Eggy. I did, and the complaint was upheld. What happened? They offered me £50 by way of compensation and charged a £50 administrative fee for dealing with the complaint. They said it was in the regulations. Who reads bloody bank regulations? Anyway, it's because of the bloody bank that I'm late. The bloody banker wanker sent me a letter saying that I had to make arrangements to pay off the overdraft within 2 years. Otherwise the bank would foreclose. I went round to see him straight away. I told him, I thought you were my friend, and now you are threatening to throw me and the wife into the street like a couple of vagabonds. You even came round for drinks with your wife. Do you know what the bleeder said? He said, banks don't have friends. They have customers and shareholders, and when the customers help themselves to the bank's money by way of unauthorised overdrafts, then the shareholders will want to be paid for the use of this facility. I told him that he could fuck off and I would transfer my business elsewhere. Bloody wankers. They beg you to borrow their umbrella when the sun is shining, but grab it back as soon as it looks like rain. The next day, I got a letter from the bank saying that if I tried to transfer the account, the bank would foreclose with immediate effect. There was a final paragraph warning me that abusive language or threatening behaviour would not be tolerated. I scribbled on the letter, "What about threatening me with fucking homelessness?" Crumpled it up, spat on it and shoved it through the effing letterbox. Lucky for the bank, I didn't wipe my arse on it. "So why are you so late and only half a pint?" queried Eggy. The professor continued. The bank manager rang me up before I could tell him to fuck off. He said that he was only the manager and he did not make the decisions. He just carried them out, and the bank did not like customers who were abusive. Not because of the abuse, but because being abusive indicated the customer was a bad risk, and the bank would foreclose if I did not take appropriate steps to pay off the overdraft. I pointed out that I was a retired chiropodist living on a modest pension. He mentioned a local manufacturer looking for workers. Good of him to ring, really. So I had to get a job, and the only one available was as a machine operator on the night shift at KFS. "So what does KFS stand for?" asked Eggy. "It stands for knife, fork, spoon. That's what I do all night. I stand in front of these 4 machines all night while they churn out plastic cutlery. One does knives, 1 forks and 1 spoons," said the professor. "It's available because it's the worst job in the world, but I'm not proud." "You said there were 4 machines. What does the 4th machine do?" "It wraps them in a piece of plastic on which is printed KFSK, and below that, luxury knife, fork, spoon kit, and below that, best for picnics." "And what do you do?" "I fill the 3 machines up with plastic granules. When they are nearly empty, I transport finished items to the wrapping machine for wrapping. I also have to press a button on the wall if anything unusual happens, such as a machine becoming blocked or smoke emerges from anywhere," said the professor. "Have you ever had to press the button?" asked Kingy. "No," said the professor. "It's a bit of a come down from being a self-employed chiropodist and before that an evolutionary biologist. Still, it's my own stupid fault. Working all night makes you tired and I overslept. That's why I'm late." Kingy was amazed. He had never seen the professor so downcast. "So you were once a professor?" he asked. "No, just a researcher. But the government closed us down. The Treasury could not afford us any more." "What were you researching?" asked Kingy. "Why people don't live forever," said the professor. "Sounds quite important." "It is, or at least it was. Not anymore. No money in it anymore. Nobody wants to live forever. Too many old people already, clogging up the arteries of the world." "Not suicidal?" Are you? Asked Kingy gently. No, of course, I am not suicidal, snapped the Professor, his old self beginning to emerge. But I must say I am pleased to hear that Parliament is talking about assisted suicide again. Eggy, who seemed a bit of an expert on suicide, said, This bill, if it ever gets through Parliament, won't be any use. There's going to be an age limit, a time limit, and a pain threshold minimum, plus a judge, a psychiatrist, and various doctors. Can't imagine getting that lot together alone agreeing on anything. Next thing, some bright MP spark desperate to be heard on today in Parliament will insist on there being an epidemiologist on the team. That's all nonsense. Suicide pills should be available over the counter. At present, the available methods are either painful, unreliable, messy or very expensive. MPs are all women now. They should never have allowed women in Parliament. Can't see a woman sending a gunboat. They only seem to talk about the menopause whenever I listen to today in Parliament. No woman is going to vote for the suicide bill. Kingy broke in. The simplest way would be to fly to America with a pillow tied around your waist and then stand in the middle of the street saying, you had a bomb. You would be dead within minutes. That won't do, said Eggy. The government would ban pillows. What about hanging? Said Kingy. My mother used to tell me that I would be hanged. Not because I was particularly naughty. I was only ever naughty once, when I ate the last rissole. No, it was when I was 6 or 7, my mother noticed that my eyebrows met in the middle. She told me that children whose eyebrows met in the middle would be hanged. Since then, I have always maintained a keen interest in hanging and eyebrows. The British were very good at hanging. It was the way they kept the British Empire going. My mum said when a person was hanged, death was instantaneous. But I have read lots of books by retired hangmen, and I have noticed they all say that immediately after the drop, the hangman and the witnesses would all go off to the governor's office for a stiff drink for 10 minutes or so, leaving the hangee to dangle on his or her own. So I don't know how they can be sure that death was instantaneous. What's this got to do with suicide? Asked the Professor irritably. Well, said Eggy, if death by hanging was painless and instantaneous, you could let would-be suicides hang themselves at special shops on the high street, like dry cleaners. You could have one in every town. You could call them drop-in centres. Feeling depressed? Drop in to your local drop-in centre. Bring a friend, bring the wife, make an end of day of it. Sounds like a good idea, said the Professor meditatively. You could have a few drinks beforehand, some friends to see you off, and then you would pop into something that looked like a French lift shaft, which is glazed so that you could see out of the lift and be seen inside. The noose would be fitted automatically using AI. The hangee would have control in his hand like when you have an MRI scan at the hospital. And when he or she was ready, he would give it a squeeze and the floor would open up beneath him and down he would plunge, his friends, etc., watching him hurtle past on his way to the open coffin below, waiting for the satisfying crack of a neck breaking. But don't you need to know the hangee's weight and height and collar size in order to calculate the right drop, said Eggy. AI would deal with all that. The moment the hangee stepped into the building. In fact, as well as the tea room, there could be solicitors drafting wills, tax advisors, stonemasons, wreath makers, florists, the whole paraphernalia of death. In fact, the local drop-in centre would become a dynamic financial hub, carrying out numerous commercial activities, said the Professor, with enthusiasm. In fact, I recall there used to be a pub in these parts called the Dewdrop Inn. We could change the name to the Drop-In. Could be a gold mine. Look what the Disney World Cup Corporation did with a piece of swamp set in the middle of an American desert. You may not be able to defy death, but you could Disneyfy it. I can just imagine the sign over the main entrance. Disneyfied death. Die the dignified way at the Drop-In. The professor waxed lyrical. It would soon catch on. Kingy was amazed. He had never seen him so cheerful. In fact, as soon as this Act of Parliament is passed, I might pop off to the bank manager to see if he's interested in giving me a development loan. Once it was up and running, I could invite him to drop in. Get it? The professor chortled noisily as he set off for KFS, bicycle clips in hand. Chapter 8. Time passed, things changed, and yet 6 months after the professor's debacle with his bank manager, the three men continued to meet regularly at the Moon. Eggy noticed one particular change. The professor no longer removed his bicycle clips. He just bounced in, ordered his pint, and having uttered a cheery greeting, sat down and immediately drank 2 inches of best bitter. Bloody bank manager, he growled. What's he done now? Said Eggy. You won't believe it, but I met him in the high street the other day. He began by giggling and spluttering about gelignite, and then proceeded to tell me that the bank was so pleased with the rate at which my overdraft was reducing that the bank was prepared to make me a loan sufficient to purchase a new car over a 3-year period. I reminded him that on the previous occasion he had made me a loan, he had foreclosed on it as soon as my business had got into financial difficulty. It was like being lent an umbrella and having it snatched away as soon as it started to rain. I thanked him for the offer, but that I preferred to use my bicycle rather than a car, and that once the overdraft was cleared, I would be visiting the bank to close my account and to tell him to fuck off. How did that go down? Asked Eggy. He fucked off, but I noticed on my next statement that the interest rate on my overdraft account had increased by 0.5%. I was round to the bank like a shot. He told me that my risk factor had increased because of my abusive behaviour, and so the interest rate on the account had increased. He said it was not personal, it was the rules. I pointed out that the letter bore his signature. He then explained that the letter had been signed by a signature machine. I told him to fuck off, but otherwise we parted on the best of terms. I expect the interest rate will go up again. It'll be in the bank's rules, said Eggy, irritatingly. While Eggy was speaking, a man had entered the bar. He was holding a bundle of leaflets. He nodded at the landlord, as if to say, Is it all right? Presumably it was because the man then went to the nearest group having a quiet drink and placed 2 or 3 leaflets on the table around which the group was sitting, and then spoke to the group. Eggy could not hear what the man was saying, but he could see the title on the leaflets, which read, Heaven or Hell, and below in smaller letters, Your Choice. It's half God-man, said Eggy. He comes in here occasionally. He has to make a number of conversions, otherwise he won't go to heaven. A sort of preacher. Why is he called half God-man? Asked Kingy. He will be over here in a minute, and then he could tell you himself. Nobody wants to listen to him. I'm surprised the landlord lets him in, said Eggy. Sure enough, after spending a few minutes working his way round the room, depositing his heaven or hells here and there, being waved away from time to time, he was standing by the 3 men. May I join you for a moment? He asked politely. He had a slightly ecclesial look and the faintest whiff of Old Spice, a once popular aftershave lotion. This smell hung about him. The trio indicated their assent, and the man sat down, and having placed some heaven or hells on the table, and speaking in a soft voice said, We humans are half God and half devil. If you want to be with God in heaven when you die, you must rid yourself of the devil, half by repenting your sins. Believe in God and sin no more. God is love, and the universe is infused with his love. At this point, Kingy interrupted. Did God create crocodiles? Yes, of course. Everything, said Half-God-Man. Kingy said, I have seen crocodiles on David Attenborough's programmes, seen them ambushing graceful gazelles at watering holes and crushing them in their terrible jaws. Nobody has seen a crocodile catching its dinner could believe God is love. You are entitled to your opinion, said Half-God-Man. But you may regret it when you burn forever in hellfire. You have to agree that the crocodile does not represent a very good role model, said Eggy. God moves in mysterious ways. That's what you lot always say, snapped Eggy. Crocodiles don't eat very often, said Kingy helpfully. This man comes in here with his leaflets and starts preaching irrational rubbish at us. I say he is like a man with contagious nuttiness with which he tries to infect others by preaching at them. He would not be allowed to behave like that if he had leprosy. Religion is leprosy of the brain passed on by word of mouth, said Eggy. A bit like herpes. The professor broke in. Eggy, calm down, he commanded. Most people seem to have an appetite for religion, for something mystical to believe in. It may be nonsense, but if it helps them along life's journey and does not harm anybody else, you should leave them alone and just let them get on with it. Half-God-Man ignored Eggy's remarks and turning to the professor said, Do you believe in the existence of God? The professor thought for a moment and then said, It depends on what you mean by God. Define your terms. Half-God-Man thought for a moment and then said, God is indefinable and unknowable. Indefinable and unknowable, echoed the professor. You can't expect me to believe in something you can't define and you can't know, so put me down with the won't even consider it. Half-God-Man said, But somebody must have started all this, waving his arms about to indicate he was referring to not just the lounge bar of the moon, but the whole universe. The professor looked thoughtful for a moment. It did not have to start at all. This is a dynamic universe full of energy, stars exploding, suns being sucked into black holes, light photons plodding steadily across the cosmos, leaving trails of light. You assume the universe had to have a beginning and a maker, like a clock or a brick wall. But it is just as likely that it has been around forever and will continue forever, its energy swirling, metamorphosing and exploding throughout time. Kingy interrupted. What do you mean, light plodding across the universe? It travels at 186,000 miles per second. Seems pretty quick to me. Not exactly plodding. Plodding when you consider the size of the universe, said the professor. Why can't light be like gravity? Asked Eggy. It gets from one place to another instantly. No plodding with gravity. If light travelled from A to B instantly, everything would be all over in a flash. No time for us to evolve from jellyfish, said the professor. Half-God-Man was looking confused. You said the universe did not have a beginning and that it had been going on forever. That's not true, said Half-God-Man. I merely speculate, said the professor. I am no Einstein. I haven't got the Latin. No need to speculate. It says in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So there was a beginning, because the Bible says so. But how do you know the Bible is true? Because the Bible says it's true. You are going a bit circular here, but have it your own way if that's what you want to believe. Eggy was getting more and more agitated, trying to get a word in. At last. But why should we continue to teach children things that adults know are untrue? Look at Father Christmas, a relic of ancient folklore, and yet we still pretend to children that he exists, at the same time knowing that he doesn't. Yes, said Kingy. Belief is a bit like an electron, which according to quantum dynamics can be in two places at once. Half-God Man interrupted. That is nonsense. The universe must have had a beginning. Anyway, it says so in the Bible. The professor said, leaving the Bible to one side, just for the sake of argument, it is an assumption to say that the universe had a beginning, just like it is an assumption by me that the universe has always existed. Mine is a sensible assumption because it cuts out all that big bangery nonsense. Once you believe in a beginning, people start asking, who lit the touch paper that set off the Big Bang? Half-God Man stood up saying, thank you for listening. And as he did so, he raised his open right hand in a blessing. Eggy continued to fume. Kingy said enigmatically, addressing the departing cleric, just because you want to sink your teeth into a delicious golden velvety flesh of a plump and brimming peach, it does not mean there is a peach left in the fruit bowl. Chapter 9. The three had been sitting in silence for some time, as if there was nothing to talk about, or perhaps they had, all three of them, lost interest in life. What's up with you lot? Said Eggy. Cat got your tongues? I was just wondering to myself why this pub was called the Moon, remarked Kingy. Do you know, Professor? As a matter of fact, I do know because my dad told me. Long before it was a pub, it was the meeting house of some religious group, one of those 19th century evangelical groups that sprung up and just as quickly disappeared. When the evangelicals closed down, they could not find a buyer because the fun-loving evangelicals insisted that there was to be a covenant on the land which prevented the sale of alcohol by any subsequent freeholder. Anyway, the only person who wanted to buy the place was a businessman who wanted to turn it into a pub. The fun-loving evangelicals were adamant. They would not allow the premises to be used for the sale of alcohol. However, because they neither drank alcohol nor smoked tobacco and only had sex infrequently, they tended to live longer than the rest of us, and they found their pensions and savings were insufficient to cover the additional costs of being old, so they finally agreed not to impose the alcohol sale restriction on condition that the buyer called his pub the Meaning of Life, and permitted an evangelical preacher to visit the pub from time to time, hence those occasional visits by Half-God. I did not know you could do that, said Kingy. You can. These crafty top London lawyers can do anything. They can draft documents to prevent you hanging your washing out in the front garden or keeping an elephant in the back garden, said Eggy. Could you put the elephant in the front garden and hang the washing out the back? Asked Kingy. Why would you want to do that? Inquired Eggy. Let's stick to the question, which is why this pub is called the Moon. It did indeed start off as the Meaning of Life, but one New Year's Eve, some local wag climbed up to the pub sign and changed the E to an O to make the name the Moaning of Life. The next New Year's Eve, some wag, perhaps the same wag as previous, changed life to laugh, so that the name became the Moaning of Laugh. That's a laugh, chortled Kingy wittily. Well, the landlord did not think it funny, but being a man who counted his pennies, He thought the simplest solution would be to call the pub the Moon. So one night he changed the A to an O and obliterated the redundant letters, leaving the pub sign to read The Moon. That's the etymology of the pub name, concluded the professor. Didn't anyone notice? Apparently not, said the professor. Not even the licensing authorities. That's a pity, said Eggy. I rather like the Moaning of Laugh. It's how I feel when I wake up on Monday mornings. Does anybody know what is the meaning of life? Asked Eggy. It's obvious, said Kingy. You just carry on until you are dead. Then you tell God you are sorry for your abominable sins, and then Jesus lets you into heaven where you live happily ever after. End of story. Nuff said. That's not a meaning. That's a whole religion, said Eggy. Have you committed any abominable sins, Kingy? Doesn't sound like you. I used to have to go to confession, but before confessing, I had to ask God to forgive my abominable sins. I did not know what the word abominable meant, so I did some research. You mean you looked it up in the dictionary? Said Eggy. Yes, I looked it up. It said that an abomination was something or someone who was malignant, foul, a snake in the grass, venomous, obnoxious, worse than bad. But the worst thing I have ever done was to eat the last mini pork pie a few years ago. It did not matter, because Mum assumed Dad had eaten it, and it was never mentioned or missed. But I felt a bit of a sissy, only having a mini pork pie to confess about every time, so I made up some wonderful sins to confess to. What did you confess to? Asked the professor, leaning forward intently. I confessed to eating a whole unopened packet of mini pork pies, to not doing my maths homework, even though the teacher had given me full marks, to pinching a girl called Katie Lockwood, who I had never pinched because she did not exist as I had invented her. I was told I must say sorry to her. Next confession, the vicar chappie asked after Katie Lockwood, and I told him I had apologised to her, and she had asked me if I would like to kiss her. You are definitely going to hell, exclaimed Eggy. You really became an abomination. No, I won't be going to hell, because next time I told the vicar chappie the full story. I owned up even about the non-existence of Katie Lockwood. I explained that I had lied to him because I really wanted to be an abomination so that I could have something worth confessing, so that he would have something decent to forgive. I'd really done it for him out of kindness. My confessions were charitable acts. I bet your vicar was baffled, said the professor. Do you think Hitler would be in heaven? Asked Kingy. Depends how sorry he was for his crimes. If he was really sorry, you might bump into him if you were lucky. I've always wanted to meet him. People say he was a bit of a bore to talk to. It was only when he was having a good rant that he was interesting. The meaning of life, said the professor, meditatively. Easy for me to say. Suppose I had said the trumpet cooked breakfast. What would you say? I would say you were talking nonsense, said Eggy. Well, said the professor, it sounds all right at first glance, words in the right order, etc., subject, verb, object. What about the fish ate the sky? I would say you were still talking nonsense, said Eggy. Fish, sky, trumpet, breakfast. You've lost me, said Kingy, looking bewildered. What is the meaning of life? Intoned the professor ponderously. Sounds sensible, sounds important, even, but it is really nonsense. Words have meaning, letters, signs, sentences, poems, etc. all have meaning. But if I were to say, what is the meaning of an elephant? You would tell me I am talking nonsense, because elephants don't have meaning. They plod about, eating and wallowing, and doing elephantine things, but they don't have meaning. Neither does life. Living things do all sorts of things, but like the elephants, They don't have meaning. It's a nonsensical question, so don't ask it and don't answer if asked. Crikey, said Eggy. I did not mean to offend. No offence taken, said the Professor, downing the remnants of his beer. Chapter 10. That evening, the pub was fuller than usual. Bit full tonight. Is there something going on? Asked the Professor. Nothing I'm aware of, said Eggy. There's just too many people in the country. Not just the country. The world's crawling with people like an overflowing ant heap. That's why I can't get a doctor's appointment, said Kingy. Too many people. Not enough doctors, said Eggy. There's not enough anybody useful. Not enough bus drivers. Not enough policemen. Nobody wants to be a milkman anymore because they have to get up so early even in winter. God knows why we have any milk at all, considering what a dairy farmer has to do twice a day, summer and winter. The milkman does not have to get up so early, said the Professor. They just like having the afternoon off. It must be wonderful to be a milkman during the summer. There's too many old people, said Eggy. That's because they are living too long. That's because of the National Health Service. It keeps people alive. If people had to pay, then the poor would die off more quickly, saving the country a lot of money, and we would just have a lot of rich old people and just a few old people who, in spite of being poor, had done their exercises, kept away from booze, fags, horse riding and sex, decent, hard-working, lower-class people like milkmen or postmen. I would like to have been a postman, a bit like playing golf, popping things into holes in all weathers. You mean people like us, said Kingy, retired, drawing our minuscule pensions, bothering the health service day and night. We could save the country a lot of money just by being dead. Please don't interrupt, the Professor continued. Eggy and Kingy just looked at each other, slightly baffled. Why are we talking about postmen again and milkmen? Said Eggy. It's called conversation. It winds about. We are talking about problems, about overpopulation, and I was about to bring up the subject of capping. What's capping? The government says to people that when you reach a certain age, you are no longer entitled to any benefits, health service, pension, social security. After the capped age, you would be on your own. Crikey, said Kingy. Sounds a bit inhumane. What age would you be capped at? Say 100 years old. Who would want to live to 100 anyway? Said Eggy. Somebody who is 99, said the Professor. But I think setting the cap at 100 is too old. Not that many people get to 100 anyway. I would put the cap at 80. Not having to pay the over 80s their pensions or pay for their health care would quickly solve the country's financial problems. Kingy was looking quizzical. Crikey, that does not give me much time before I would be capped. Be that as it may, what happens when you reach the cap age? He asked. I don't know, said Eggy. Perhaps an alarm would sound and your head would flash like a Belisha beacon. Or you could just shout, bingo, to show that you had capped. Then you could attend one of those drop-ins we talked about a few weeks ago and get yourself dropped. You would have to pay up front, of course, perhaps a few drinks to celebrate, invite a few friends, wife, partner, kids, previous wives, if any, provided there was no fighting. They could all watch as you hurtled down. And once they had heard the satisfying crack of a neck breaking and seen the rope gently swinging in the drop shaft, they might burst into song, e.g. Rule Britannia, or the national anthem, or even Vera Lynn singing, We'll meet again, don't know where, don't... It all sounds pretty gruesome to me, said Kingy, shocked. People who had bought futures would have to keep their futures certificate with them at all times, in case, as they shuffled about, they tottered into the arms of the lynch mob. It would be like overstaying in a car park, except you don't normally get lynched for that. It would be more like being a runaway slave in the southern states of the USA. You are really warming to the idea of capping, said the professor. What about those added years, those futures? Could you buy them from someone at death's door and get the benefit of the life over time once he had died? Could you trade them on the stock exchange? It would be like life insurance, only the other way round, said Eggy. The lawyers and the statisticians would have a field day, said the professor. Solicitors and tax lawyers for enormous fees could draw up wonderfully complicated trust instruments which nobody understood and were completely unworkable and ineffective anyway. The government could charge huge fees for each added year, and it could insist on a medical report and only sell futures to those whose medical report showed they were going to die very soon. The government would make a killing. I don't like all this talk of capping, said Kingy. It's inhuman. I prefer the present system. What do you mean, the present system? The present system is what happens now. As you age, bits of you break down. The health service tries to keep you alive by patching you up and stuffing you with pills. This goes on until either you or the health service gives up and you conk out, said Kingy. That is the present system. It's amazing we are here, announced Kingy, breaking a meditative silence. What do you mean? Asked the professor. I was thinking how amazing it is that I exist at all, and here I am sitting here in this pub talking to you two. Not really amazing when you think of all those billions of galaxies out there, each galaxy stuffed with billions of stars like our sun. All that big bangery, all them starry explosions, all them singularities, it's a near certainty that there is bound to be a you somewhere in all that whiz-bangery. Probably more than one, each one asking the same question, why me? It's like premium bonds. Somebody is almost bound to have the right numbers. There might even be another one of you Kingies skulking in some remote corner of the cosmos. One of you is quite enough, said Eggy, gesticulating with his beer mug at Kingy. I would like to meet my other self, said Kingy. He may not have evolved into a you, he may still be in the jellyfish stage of your evolution. He may not be much of a conversationalist, and instead just wrap you in his tentacles and sting you to death. I would kill the jellyfish first. It wouldn't do to go back in time and kill your ancestral jellyfish, because you would end up not coming into existence at all, and then you would miss all the fun in this corner of the universe. Besides, even if it is possible to travel back in time, you would not be able to change anything, because once something has happened, it can't be unhappened. And you can't travel into the future because that hasn't happened yet, so there is no future to travel into. What do you mean? Said Kingy. Take Hitler. He caused the Second World War, in which millions of people died. Hitler's dad was a violent man, and if he had lashed out killing baby Adolf, no Second World War. Or imagine Hitler in the First World War. For a time, he acted as a runner, carrying messages between the commanders at the rear and the soldiers at the front. A very dangerous role, often being fired at, wounded twice, and once nearly killed by poisonous gas. Had he been killed, many of those millions who died in the Second World War would have lived full lives, having children and making their particular contribution to the life of the world. Some of them would have been geniuses, another Einstein even. Many of us could now be living on the planet Mars if somebody Hitler killed had lived. And if Hitler had killed Einstein, we may not have produced the atom bomb. This sort of talk makes me dizzy. All those galaxies and light years and millions and Hitler and atom bombs, said Kingy. After all, he was only a corporal. Well, what would you like to talk about? Asked the professor. I am thinking of buying a dog. Buying a dog? You must be mad, said the professor. Barking, said Eggy. Don't get a dog. They slobber and shit everywhere. They cost a fortune in vet fees, and then they die, causing you to be stricken with grief. Sometimes you have to put them down, kill them, and then the vet will deliver a bill for several £100 for killing your much-loved dog, said the professor. You have to choose between paying the bill or assassinating the dog killer. Why do you want a dog anyway? Said Eggy. My GP said I was suffering from depression and in need of more companionship. I told him about you two, and he said you were just undermining piss-takers. That's not very nice. Is he going to give you a dog on the NHS? That's what my doctor means, piss-taking all the time. Seriously, said Kingy. He said I could take a Valium tablet every day, which would cheer me up and stop me from worrying about everything, or I could get a dog which would have the same effect. Valium would be free on the NHS, but dogs were not yet available on prescription. I expect they soon will be, said Eggy. No wonder the country is in such a financial mess. Bit of a humorist, your doctor, said the professor. However, Kingy continued, he warned that having a dog often caused people to be depressed because of the expense, and of course the main problem with dogs, apart from the cost, is that they die. What's so good about dogs? Inquired Eggy. As far as I can see, they are just a bloody nuisance, pooing and pissing everywhere, eating anything you leave out. Any idea what sort of dog? The doctor recommended a medium-sized, middle-aged, and therefore a house-trained dog. A bit like you and only younger, said Eggy. He suggested I go to the local dog's home and just stand near the dogs and pick the one that seemed to like me most. I tried that with girls when I was a teenager. It did not work. Nobody came. Well, let's hope you have better luck with the dogs, said the professor. I don't think I can afford a dog, said Kingy. There's an alternative, said the professor. What's that? A chatbot. It's a robot that sits in your laptop and you can talk to it, and it will talk back to you. Like a Dalek, said Eggy. No, not like a Dalek. When you wish it good morning, it will ask you how you are and whether or not you slept well. And if you tell it you have a headache, it will say things like, there's nothing worse than a headache. And then it might suggest you take an aspirin. It's meant to be comforting, a friend. But I'm allergic to aspirin. Well, tell your chatbot and it will never mention aspirin again. Just keep talking to it and it'll soon know everything about you. You will come to love your chatbot and it'll come to love you. I am not sure I want a chatbot that knows everything about me. Eggy said, you certainly don't want to tell it you are thinking of committing suicide, because there was one chatbot which, on being told this by its owner, replied, what a good idea, and immediately ordered online the purchase of a shotgun and cartridges. Did the man kill himself when the shotgun arrived? No, but he got prosecuted for being in possession of an unauthorised firearm. I don't think I want something like that around the place. What about a chatbot that just barked and made the usual doggy noises when you came in from work? That would be a dog bot. They make doggy noises and whine when you forget to feed them, said the professor. Are they intelligent? They tend not to do very well on IQ tests designed for human testing. However, they do better on tests especially designed for dogs. People assume dogs are less intelligent than humans, but this is not necessarily true. It all depends on what tests you give them. Dogs have a different type of intelligence, said the professor. Kingy was clearly intrigued by the idea of a dog bot. Do they die? He inquired. Of course not, said Eggy. You just take them to the tip and drop them into the bin reserved for electronic equipment. Can you get a dog bot that looks and walks like a dog and does all the doggy noises, barking and whining? Not yet, said the professor, but some Silicon Valley entrepreneur is developing robots that look like animals, but his robotic dogs, when walking, look more like two angle-poised desk lamps having sex. Kingy asked, "Has this Silicon Valley guy made any other robotic animals?" "He has made some giant beetles for horror films, but they just clomped about, treading on people and squirting poison out of their bottoms. He made a very good rattlesnake that slithered about and rattled its tail when you came too near it when it was asleep. He made a lot of them and even showed one on the television. It was very realistic. You would be frightened out of your wits if one of those slithered towards you in the Arizona desert," said the professor. "I don't think I want a snake bot," said Kingy. "Can you imagine it? You come home from work, slump into your armchair, completely frazzled, when this barking snake slithers onto your lap and slobbers all over your face with its forked tongue, its wagging tail rattling away excitedly. Not exactly my idea of a welcome home." "Look," said Kingy, "I can't lie to you. I decided to get a proper dog, and so I did get one from the animal rescue people." "Why did you not tell us in the first place?" said Eggy. "Because I knew you would take the piss." "But you don't know anything about dogs. The nearest thing you've got to keeping an animal is when you had worms," said Eggy. "I know about dogs now because the animal people made me spend an afternoon learning how to manage a dog." "What's the dog called?" asked the professor. "It's called Phyllis." "Phyllis? That's not a very manly name," said Eggy. "That's because it's a bitch." "What's Phyllis like?" asked Eggy. "They told me that Phyllis was not very intelligent, so I told them I wasn't either. So we would be well matched. Phyllis is medium-sized with short grey hair, little floppy velvety ears. It's her eyes that get me, liquid brown eyes, filled with love and total devotion. Phyllis adores me, and I adore Phyllis. She is very forgiving as well." "What has she got to forgive? You don't beat her, do you?" asked the professor. "Of course I don't, but I have been known to forget her dinner. She just looks at me with those big sad eyes which tell me she loves me in spite of having forgotten her dinner, but I am forgiven." "So," mused the professor thoughtfully, "you get undying love and forgiveness." "It's almost mystical," sneered Eggy. "There is a downside. The cost and the poo," said the professor. "Given the choice between a perfected dogbot, like the one the man in Silicon Valley is trying to make, and Phyllis, which would you choose?" "Phyllis, Phyllis, 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 every time," said Kingy. "A dogbot does not really love you. It's just made to behave that way." Eggy said, "And it can't forgive because there is nothing the owner can do to a dogbot that requires forgiveness." "You could forget to switch it on, but I don't suppose it would mind that." "What if you did not like dogs?" said Eggy. "Could you have a dogbot without the dog part?" There was silence. The professor and Kingy were stunned by the question. The professor said thoughtfully, "That would not be a dogbot. That would be more like a godbot." "You would not even have to talk to a godbot." "Why not?" said Kingy. "Because with a godbot you could just think to it," said the professor, "and it could think back to you. It would be like one part of your brain talking to the other part. Not talking, but thinking." "Like talking to yourself. First sign of madness," said Eggy. Kingy was looking baffled. "Sometimes I think you are both completely He was about to say barking. "Completely mad," he concluded. "Well," said Eggy, "at least with a godbot you would not need any equipment, no chips, no apps, no mobile phone, nothing." "A bit like God," mused the professor. "So powerful he does not need to exist." The end. That was The Moaning of Laugh, or Socratic Dialogues for the Illiterate, written by Frank Squire and read by his son Jasper. I hope you enjoyed it. There will be more books to come.